Hello and welcome to Buy Africa, the show where we focus on investment opportunities around the continent. I'm Tshepo Modiba, your host. Today joining me on the show is Langa Madonko from Africa Strategic Impact Advisors with a specific focus on Zimbabwe. Langa, now this is one market certainly for South Africans that's been fascinating, and in the broader context of the continent, certainly one that we've paid lots of attention to. How is Zimbabwe doing?
Zimbabwe, quite an interesting country, formerly called the breadbasket of Africa. Then you had the whole land reform debacle that then led to the whole us getting to this situation where we are now. But again, I think it's only fair to say that it's a country that holds a whole lot of great promise across sectors, from the infrastructure play all the way to agro-processing, and also, of course, resources space.
So really a similar theme to the rest of the continent, stumbled a little bit, but lots of potential for prospective investors.
Lots of potential, and I think the only deterrent at present to people investing in Zimbabwe is always going to be the political risk, because there's a whole lot of policy fluctuations that have occurred in the past, and I think a lot of people continue to judge Zimbabwe on the basis of those events that have happened prior.
So ultimately, investors are trying to assess some sort of stability from a political perspective, because they want to know exactly what the terms are for investment.
Yeah, I think everybody has a perspective where they are on a wait and see, but you tend to realize that there's several players who are actually adopting a hold and see position, where they are going into Zimbabwe looking for investment opportunities, not really exposing themselves to the extent that they should be, but they want to have some kind of positions so that should the turn start to begin, they are starting from a place where they have actually a platform and a base to maneuver in the economy.
And economically, how is the economic performance or outlook looking?
You know, prior to the scenario where there was the whole economic land reform, Zimbabwe was one of the countries that gave us good growth rates. And I think that period where it had hyperinflation and reached record levels, I mean, the second highest in the history of the world, that was the point where it dipped. And then thereafter, it has steadily given growth. I think in 2009, the GDP there was about 9 million, and then it's consistently been growing. And I think last year they were looking at about 15 billion US dollars in GDP. A relatively small number, but considering where they're coming from, I think that's a positive sign.
Sure. Now, if we drill down from, I guess, underlying businesses within that environment, certainly even with the flux, you've had some businesses doing phenomenally well, participating in the growth from a 9 billion economy to a 14 billion economy, and we'll touch on a few of them. But it certainly hasn't been all bad news.
It hasn't all been bad news. I mean, some of the players that are in that market are continuing to show growth. Of course, they get a few hiccups here and there, but generally a lot of the companies that are listed on the exchange, particularly in the top 10 bracket, are continuing to attract foreign investment, not to the levels that they would like. And then also one of the positives for me is that they continue to yield dividends on a year-on-year basis.
We touch on the top 10. Is that a function of size and liquidity?
Yes, it's mostly a function of size and liquidity. Everybody who's looking at the market, for example, looking at someone like Delta, the largest company on the stock exchange by market cap, and also because of its diversity in terms of holdings that it has in its portfolio, as both a business in terms of products and as an investor. It's a business that continues to make sense, and a similar situation continues to run through in terms of the other businesses in the top 10 and how they've diversified their approach to the Zimbabwean economy. So
let's start with Delta. Goes back several decades in terms of its history, I think founded in the 1960s. Now, this is a brewery. How do you view the business?
I think it's a very good business. I think one of the things that they've done really well is to integrate their supply chain. They've made investments into their providers of raw material, but they've also made investments into what would be considered upstream business, for example, in the manufacturing of packaging and bottling businesses. And so they have an integrated business, and one of the things that has been an advantage brought about by that type of system is that where, for example, the mainstream beer business has lagged, they've managed to have an upswing in the sorghum production business and also in the bottling and canning business.
Okay. So underlying production is done in Zimbabwe?
Underlying production is done in Zimbabwe. They've got two large factories, one in Harare and one in Bulawayo for the bulk of their produce. But one of the anchor brands which is really exciting right now and is stimulating their stability is the Chibuku brand, which is one of a sorghum-based beer. And for that, their model is one where they have production as close as possible to the market. And I think to date they've got about 18 plants, and they are also producing Chibuku here in South Africa and in Nigeria.
So the underlying supply of raw material that they need for production, is it stable? Are they able to meet the demand?
I think where they've been smart, like I said before, is in their active participation in their raw material supply chain. They have a business that has a holding in several farming businesses and in several businesses that process the sorghum to what they require. And that has been key to them managing to sustain the type of numbers that they produce in that business.
And in terms of market share, how big are we looking at in terms of the Zim market? In
terms of the Zim market, I think they own 30% of their largest competition. And you are looking at about 72% market share across the chain. And they divide their product structure into three parts. You get what they call economy, which is where the Chibuku brand falls in. Then you get mainstream, where you've got your Castle Lagers, and then they've got.
So they do distribution of the likes of Castle.
Yeah, they do the distribution of the likes of Castle, but they're also in the beverage space distributing your Coca-Colas, and they also have a show holding in another competitor, Schweppes, which does your cordials. And so they've managed with that structure to be a dominant player in their particular space.
Now, dominance aside, what does that mean operationally? Has this been a business that's done well operationally?
Operationally, they've done well. Very strong management team that have got all the fundamentals right. But like any other business in Zimbabwe, they'll always continue to lament that the fundamentals of the economy are a little bit skewed. And that does affect the way business is done. And then some of the political or government decisions that are made do from time to time tend to shake the foundation, but they've managed to weather the storm. Even in instances where they've experienced decreased revenue, they have managed by adjusting some of the ways in which they operate to continue to generate a good dividend yield.
Now, taking all of that into account, is this one that excites you as a potential investor?
Yes, it's definitely something that I would take and I would hold.
Okay, all right. If we can move elsewhere in terms of the market, a business that I certainly find fascinating, Econet, your thoughts on the business?
Econet, the baby of Strive Masiwa. It's definitely something that as well I think is exciting and offers a lot of potential in terms of future growth. Also, they've adopted a model similar to Delta, where they've gone away from what was their core niche business and started to offer some other lines following an opportunistic approach.
Just for the benefit of the viewers, Econet is a mobile service producer, so essentially the MTN of Zimbabwe. I
think, yeah, Econet is at its foundation a telecoms business, but now where it is, it's a telecoms and financial services business, if we're being honest about it. I think in Zimbabwe it has about 64% of the market share in terms of cell phone networks, about 9 million subscribers, according to their latest annual report.
In a market that has a very high penetration from a cell phone usage perspective.
They have been the main driver for the cell phone penetration. They've taken it from a situation where I think about 3-4 years back you were looking at about 72%, and now it sits at about 106%, and they account for the majority of that growth in terms of penetration. And that has been driven by their data business, but more than anything it's been driven by their money transfer business.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of the infrastructure certainly that is needed to facilitate the data business, are we seeing a continuation in spend?
They're really smart spenders in that space, because one of the things that they do is they continue to develop their infrastructure so they stay ahead, but they are also cognizant of the other facets of the business that can leverage from the same infrastructure. And so what would be considered in most markets a direct spend for the purposes of developing the networks exclusively for data, for them has an implication on the other businesses. So the whole integrated group, I think last year spent about $75 million in terms of spend for development of infrastructure, but split across the businesses, that's not as significant as it sounds.
Now, if we go to the financial services part of this business, this is an area that they seem to be doing quite well at. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that was a very smart play. As you know, on the African continent, mobile solutions for money transfer are the in thing.
Mobile banking is the big thing, hey?
You've got M-Pesa in East Africa, you've got Wari in West Africa, and they saw the opportunity, particularly with so many Zimbabweans being in the diaspora and also with the instability within the banking sector. They then went into that space to say, okay, look, how do we maneuver? And they produced a product called EcoCash that they use for the transfer of funds. And subsequent to that, EcoBank has taken up a significant stake in one of the Zimbabwean banks, which has also helped to improve its position in terms of that space, because now they've got an agent that can receive beyond the remittance system that works on the mobile platform.
Okay. Now, in terms of the outlook for the business as a whole, certainly the mobile banking is an area that can grow quite nicely given the low banking penetration. Your view on the prospects for the business, and finally your view on whether this is one that you like?
I think the business has got very good prospects. One of the new offerings that they've brought in is Eco Farmer, which is a microinsurance business for farmers. And so I think the direction they're heading in the financial services, taking into consideration the reluctancy of many external players to continue to participate as aggressively as they do in other countries, definitely gives them a position where they are on the front foot in that space. And it will definitely be one of the things that also leads to a growth in their mobile business. So I think they are set to do well. In my own personal opinion, in Zimbabwe, they are currently number 2.
Yeah.
As to whether or not it's one that I would hold, I think...
Are you leaning towards the fence on this one?
I'm on the fence because I think I have a continent-wide perspective of the mobile space and also of mobile money, and therefore I see one or two other players that would make me more inclined, but if it was a Zimbabwe-specific portfolio, definitely one I would have.
Okay, let's leave it there. Thanks to my guest, Langa Madonko from Africa Strategic Impact Fund. So the gist of it is, even in a slightly bearish market, there are some opportunities to look for. Let's leave it there. That's all from Buy Africa this week. Remember to follow me on Twitter, that's @Modiba_Tshepo, and send us your thoughts about the show using the hashtag BuyAfrica. For myself and the team, goodbye.